Hey everybody, welcome to the Leek. I'm John as always, and it's time for the blue Eldritch Moon set review. For those of you who didn't watch the first video, you probably should. You probably want to know what all the colors do in this set, not just blue. But there are three disclaimers that I will quickly recap right now. First and foremost, most importantly, this is a limited set review. This is talking about draft and sealed. It is not discussing or grading for standard, modern, legacy, vintage, any sort of constructed formats or anything like that. Number two, these are my first impressions of these cards. I haven't played with them. I haven't proxied them out. I haven't tested them. These are my first impressions with these cards. So my ratings might change. I do every single set a top 10 cards that I was wrong about video near the end of the set, and that will of course be coming with Eldritch Moon just like every other set, but these are my first impressions. Number three, these are my opinions. I don't do a set review to tell you the absolute true grade. I do a set review to get you talking, to get you thinking about the grades. So definitely discuss with me down below, discuss with other people down below how you would rate these cards. I don't make any suggestions that I am absolutely correct. If I did, I wouldn't do a top 10 on cards I was wrong about video. So yeah, three quick disclaimers there. We're going to jump right on into the video now. Up first in blue, we have Advanced Stitchwing. 3 blue for a creature, zombie, horror at uncommon. It's a 3/4, it has flying, and for 2 and a blue and discarding 2 cards, you can return Advanced Stitchwing from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is literally just Stitchwing Scab, but it costs more and has more toughness. Is that a good deal? Well, you know, it's still probably fine. Stitchwing Scab was nice because it was nice and aggressive. It was a 3-drop, 3/1 flyer. If they didn't kill that, then you were going to get in for 3 damage a turn against most decks, unless they had a reach creature or flyers of their own. The fact that this is a 5-drop, 3/4 kind of changes it. This is no longer the nice 3-drop aggressive creature. This is much more a 3/4 kind of mid-rangey creature, almost a top end in a lot of decks, unless they're intending to go fairly late game. And if they're intending to go fairly late game, a 3/4 isn't the best. So I think its playability does get knocked down a peg. I think it is still playable if you're in the market for a 5-drop. And since Stitchwing Scab was pretty solidly a B, I would say, I think this kind of gets knocked down to about B-. It's definitely less good than Stitchwing Scab, but I think it is still playable. It's still fine, just not in the most aggressive of decks. So B- for Advanced Stitchwing. Up next, we have Chillin Grasp. Chillin Grasp is 2 and a blue for an instant at uncommon. Tap up to 2 target creatures. Those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. And you can madness it out for 3 and a blue, so you can actually pay more if you want, but it's already instant, so you're not getting any benefit. The only reason you would really do this is if you're discarding for some other reason to get some benefit, and you may as well get a card attached to it. I'm not totally sure if I like that as the madness cost. It definitely takes away from kind of the upside of madness while leaving really one of the lesser parts of the upside of madness attached. It is still a solid card though. Getting 2 creatures for only 3 mana is a pretty great deal. This isn't really a first pick or even that high of a pick, but you'll probably include this in a number of decks. Aggro decks like it because you can keep smashing through by keeping their blockers down. Tempo decks love it because it buys them some time. Even control decks are happy-ish with it. Although they'd probably prefer something a little bit more permanent most of the time. Still seems solid. I expect to play these, just not too terribly often for their madness cost. So C+, I think they're includable. I think they're fine. Kind of a late mid-pack pickup. Up next, we have Coax from the Blind Eternities. Coax from the Blind Eternities is a sorcery at rare. It's for 2 and a blue. You may choose an Eldrazi card you own from outside the game or in exile, reveal that card, and put it into your hand. Let me tell you right now, this is Call of the Gatewatch level terrible. You're going to hate to open this card. It's going to be one of the worst rares you could ever open. Just to clear up any confusion that might exist, in a sanctioned Magic event, so anything that's at any store ever that isn't you and your friends just playing by yourself, outside of the game means your sideboard. You can't just bring in a big box of Eldrazi and then pick and choose whichever one you want out of your box that you brought. It has to be a card that you drafted or that was in your sealed pool. And if your Eldrazi is in your sideboard and it's so amazing that you want to play this card, why aren't you just playing it in your deck? I can't imagine any reason that you wouldn't just play that Eldrazi card in your deck rather than use Coax to go and get it into your hand because you still have to cast it. So F- on this, hard F-. I don't think you should ever take or ever play this card ever. Ever. Just never. Hard F-. Up next, we have Contingency Plan. Contingency Plan is 1 and a blue for a sorcery at common. It says, look at the top 5 cards of your library. Put any number of them into your graveyard and the rest back on top of your library in any order. Stacking your deck is never quite as good as new players think it is. Stacking your deck while throwing away the garbage that you don't want to draw at all does seem a little bit better. But still, I have no idea where this card actually sits, because I don't have any experience with cards similar to this. The cards that I've played with similar to this are things like Index, where you stack your deck. You don't get to throw away the garbage. It's pretty cheap at 2 mana, but it is very, very, very slow. You're not drawing anything off of this. You're just putting it on top of the deck in the order that you want. Ultimately, I imagine this probably isn't really playable except maybe in the spell-heavy deck that does look like it still exists in this format. So realistically, I think this is probably a D+. I'm going to keep an eye on it just because I've never played with a card with this exact effect before. But I have a feeling it's pretty unplayable, so D+. Next up, we have Convolute. Convolute is 2 and a blue for an instant at common. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 4 generic mana. I loved Spell Shrivel probably a little bit more than I should have in Battle for Zendikar, and this card is just Spell Shrivel, minus the Exile clause. I tended towards blue-black control decks in the Battle for Zendikar format. That's why I liked Spell Shrivel probably a little bit more than I should have. Those decks were not super viable in Shadows, but maybe they'll come back in Eldritch Moon. And if they do, I'll probably play them, and if I do, I'll be valuing this card a little bit higher than I should be. 4 generic mana is just a cost that most players can't pay in most situations. Obviously, it does go down later in the game. You don't want to try playing this on turn 9 when your opponent is playing, nothing less than a 5-drop, because they're just going to pay for it. But early game especially, this is a solid counterspell. I'm going to go with C+, but be aware that that's me probably overrating this ever so slightly. It's probably more likely a C, maybe even a C-, especially if you're not all in on a control-y late game kind of deck. But for me especially, this is a C+ for sure. Next up is Curious Homunculus. Curious Homunculus is 1 and a blue for a creature homunculus at uncommon. It's a 1/1. It has tap, add colorless mana to your mana pool. Spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery spell. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 3 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard, transform Curious Homunculus. Curious Homunculus transforms into Voracious Reader. Voracious Reader is a creature Eldrazi homunculus. It's a 3/4, it has prowess, and instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This feels a little bit narrow to me. In most decks, it's a 1/1 for 1 that a couple of times in the game will have a brief upside of tapping for mana, and maybe you have 3 instants and or sorceries in your graveyard and it can transform. At which point it's a 3/4 with prowess, and you've probably cast most of your instant sorceries, so you're not even going to get that upside. In the heavy spells deck, this obviously gets a lot better, as it's basically ramp, and then further ramp by making your spells cheaper, plus you've got a 3/4 prowess, which is going to actually activate if you're casting a whole lot of spells. So in those decks, I think it could be a decent role player, but I don't think this is really a reason to go into them exactly, although it could be, and that I'll have to keep an eye on. I'm just going to take this moment here to talk about the instant and sorceries deck. As we knew it in Shadows over Innistrad, it was arguably the Rise from the Tides deck. You should basically treat the Rise from the Tides deck as dead. You get 1 pack of Shadows over Innistrad at the end of the draft, so Rise from the Tides might even not exist in your pool. Nobody might open it, and so if you were building towards it and you had no other real way of taking super advantage of the spells, you're going to be in for a bad time. So treat the Rise from the Tides deck as dead. There are definitely payoff cards for going heavy in spells in Eldritch Moon, so don't worry, the deck still exists, I'm pretty sure. But don't expect to get a Rise from the Tides. You may very well never see it, because it may just not exist. Anyway, so Curious Homunculus, I think, is going to be a decent role player in those decks, but in every other deck, I think it's going to be terrible. So I'm going to go kind of D- on most decks, and in the deck that it's actually pretty good, I'm going to say probably like a B-. So kind of a split grade for Curious Homunculus. Up next, we have Displace, which is not Disperse, which I thought it was when I saw the title. Displace, 2 and a blue for an instant. Exile up to 2 target creatures you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. This is kind of like 2 Cloud Shifts stapled together with a 1-mana tax extra. This is obviously extremely deck dependent. If you're heavy on enter the battlefield effects, then this could be a pretty good way to abuse them. If you're not, this card is pretty awful and basically a fog, and not even a fog at that. I even misread this card, so it's even worse than I originally thought. I thought that you could use this as token removal, but you have to target creatures you control, so it's not even token removal. I think the value of this will vary from okay if you're stocked full of ETB effects, right down to unplayable trash. So I think on average, this is going to be like a D-. And even in those ETB decks, the ETB triggers must be amazing for you to want to play this card. So D-. I'm going to probably never play Displace. Next up, we have Docent of Perfection. Docent of Perfection is a 3 blue creature insect horror at rare. It's a 5/4, it has flying, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a 1/1 blue human wizard creature token onto the battlefield. Then, if you control 3 or more wizards, transform Docent of Perfection. Docent of Perfection flips on over and becomes Final Iteration. Creature Eldrazi Insect. It's a 6/5, it's got flying. Wizards you control get +2/+1 and have flying. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a 1/1 blue human wizard creature token onto the battlefield. So you know how I said there were cards that still paid off the heavy spells deck? Well, here's one of them. This just seems really, really, really good. A 5 mana, 5/4 flyer is already fine. That's already pretty aggressively costed for a 5/4 flyer. Giving it a pure upside with absolutely no downside, instant first pick. The upside's also pretty solid, even if you're in a regular deck and getting, maybe a couple of wizard tokens over the game, it's still fine. But if you are actually heavy in that deck, then you're going to get a bunch of 1/1s, your guy's going to flip, and then suddenly those 1/1s are going to become 3/2 flyers along with your 6/5 flyer. Remember as well, your Reckless Scholars, your Sanguinary Mages, your Drownyard Explorers are all wizards as well, and so they'll help flip the Docent of Perfection and get even bigger. Can you imagine a 4/5 flying Drownyard Explorers? Because that's kind of scary. This seems really, really good to me. I'm going to snap first pick this when I see it. I think it is a solid A. Up next, we have Drag Under. Drag Under is 2 and a blue for a sorcery at common. Return target creature to its owner's hand. Draw a card. I love bounce. I love bounce a lot. I prefer it to be instant speed. This is not. This is sorcery speed. But still, getting to draw a card is totally fine, and this will be some nice tempo gain. It'll help you get your attack throughs if you're being aggressive. It'll buy you some time if you're trying to get to the late game for some crazy shenanigans. It'll fuel up your Spells Matters cards. It'll make you a wizard for your Docent of Perfection. Seems just like a solid pick, and a weak first pick in some weaker packs for sure. So, solid B from me. I like Drag Under. The only way it could be better is by being instant speed. Up next, we have Enlightened Maniac. Enlightened Maniac is 3 and a blue for a creature human common. It's an 0/2. It's pretty expensive for an 0/2. It says when Enlightened Maniac enters the battlefield, put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi horror creature token onto the battlefield. So really, it's a 4 mana 3/4, which is, as I've said before, kind of like 23rd card playable. Getting that split across a 3/2 and a 0/2 is interesting and probably a little bit less worse. The thing with a 3/4 is that it's usually a decent blocker. Here, you get a chump blocker for probably 1 turn and an aggressive creature. So I think it is ultimately worse than something like a Vestige of Emrakul or something like that, unless you have some sort of synergies with the Maniac, some sort of, need for a sack target or a merging with the Maniac, something like that. Outside of that, I don't think this is that good of a card. I think it's kind of 23rd-ish. I think you want to cut it somewhat liberally unless you have a good reason. So I am going to go with a C- on Enlightened Maniac. Up next, we have Exultant Cultist. Exultant Cultist is 2 and a blue for a creature human wizard, so hey, that flips Docent as well. At common, it's a 2/2, and it says when Exultant Cultist dies, draw yourself a card. This is a 2/2 for 3, which is slightly overcosted. It's not quite a bear, but you get a card when it dies. That's totally fine to me. I'd play a couple of these quite happily. They're not splashy or amazing. They should not be in your first few picks, but they should be a high mid-pack pick for sure, and they're always playable. I'm pretty happy with Exultant Cultist. I think they're going to be really, really solid filter in basically every blue deck. So C+ for Exultant Cultist. I like it a fair bit. Up next, we have Fogwalker. Fogwalker is 1 and a blue for a creature spirit at common. It's a 1/3, it has Skulk, and when Fogwalker enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. That's even worse than I first read as well, because it does not tap the creature. Whew, boy. So this doesn't look great. It's cheaper than a Frost Lynx, but it doesn't tap the creature, it just stops them from being untapped. It's not a good attacker, it's a 1/3. That's not that good. And because of that severe mismatch, I think this is significantly less than a Stitched Mangler. I think this belongs in a late game focused deck, and even then, especially after realizing that it doesn't even tap the creature, I think this card is unplayable. I had it at a C-. I've got to go down to a D. I don't think this is playable. Do not tap your creature when your opponent plays this card. Read this card clearly. I'm going to have to tell so many people that they're wrong about this card for sure at my pre-release when I'm judging it. So yeah, Fogwalker, much worse than I first thought. I'm going to go with a D. Next up, we have Fortune's Favor. Fortune's Favor is a great Big Sea album, if you want to check out some good Celtic music. But Fortune's Favor in Magic is 3 and a blue for an instant at uncommon. Target opponent looks at the top 4 cards of your library and separates them into a face-down pile and a face-up pile. Put one pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. I like this card, but not actually like it. I like the mechanics of it. I like it. I think it's a well-designed card. You basically have to play Let's Make a Deal with your opponent and try to guess what's behind door number 2. It doesn't seem worth it to me, especially not worth 4 mana. The upside, of course, is that ideally you know your deck through and through, and so you would know if the face-up cards are the best cards in your deck and the face-down pile couldn't possibly be better. But that's going to be a very narrow case, and it shouldn't take too much intuition from your opponent to also be able to guess that. But yeah, I just don't see this being worth it. I feel like there's just way too much effort of you having to guess, is your opponent trying to one-up you? Is that face-down pile better than the face-up pile? Is that face-down pile just lands? I just don't see this being worth it. I'll keep an eye on it because, like I said, from a game design perspective, I think this is really coolly designed. I think this is really, really cool. I don't think I'll ever play it. Yeah, I don't think it's good. I don't think it's playable at all. I think it's just really cool. So I'm going to go with a D on it. Next up is Geist of the Archives. Geist of the Archives is 2 and a blue for a creature spirit at uncommon. It's an 0/4 defender, and at the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1. Scry 1 every turn for a 3 mana 0/4 wall. Absolutely super gladly will take that and play it all the time. I wish this flew, but, you know, we can't ask for everything. Not at 3 mana anyways. This seems like a great pickup for a control-y late-game deck that really wants to fix its draws while holding back your opponent. This should be a relatively high pick, I think, as scrying every turn is just fantastic. That's just so powerful, especially turn after turn after turn. I think this is a great card. I'd be very happy to potentially first pick this if there's no real bomb or solid removal in the pack. I think this is going to be a great card. I've got to go with a solid B on it. Next up, we have Grizzly Angler, this happy fisherman who just caught this giant fish and is probably going to live a long, great life just feasting off this great fish. Great. He's 2 and a blue for a creature human at uncommon. He's a 2/3, and tap it to put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. Then, if there's a colorless creature card in your graveyard, transform Grizzly Angler. And he's dead. Grizzly Anglerfish has eaten the Grizzled Angler. I believe that might actually be his head as the lure, which is creepy. Grizzly Anglerfish is a 4/5 creature Eldrazi fish where you can pay 6 generic mana to make creatures your opponents control attack this turn if able. So I don't think this is all that good, to be honest. You tap and you mill yourself for 2, which if you have graveyard synergy is cool, you know, that'll help you out a little bit. But it can only flip if there's a colorless creature card in your graveyard. And there's only a dozen colorless creature cards in this set, ignoring artifact creatures, of course, because most of them aren't really playable. A lot of the colorless creatures in the set are the back sides of cards, which don't go into your graveyard. It's the front side of the card in your graveyard. So I just don't reliably see you flipping this. Half the colorless cards, or the colorless creatures are rare, so you're not even going to have them. So I just don't know if you can actually expect to flip this guy ever. So he's just a 2/3 for 3 that mills you 2. And I don't think that's good enough. I don't think that's good enough at all. If you do flip it, you get yourself a decent creature. You get yourself a 4/5 that can force your opponents to attack. But, you know, I don't think it's going to flip with any real reliability. And I don't think getting a 4/5 that makes your opponent's creatures attack is really all that worth it. I just don't see the upside in this card. I don't see the upside in this card in limited format. If you're playing something else with a ton of colorless creatures, yeah, maybe this will work a little bit better for you, but I just don't see you flipping this with much regularity, especially not before a 4/5 that doesn't do too much, is just kind of outclassed, or at least kind of blockable. So yeah, Grizzly Angler, I'm not really sold on it. I think you'll probably cut this more often than not. I've got to go with a C- on it. I don't think it's that good. C-. Next up, we have Identity Thief. Identity Thief is 2 blue for a creature, shapeshifter at rare. It's an 0/3. Whenever Identity Thief attacks, you may exile another target non-token creature. If you do, Identity Thief becomes a copy of that creature until end of turn. Return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. This is an interesting card to rate. Normally clones are solid because you can get an extra copy of your best creature or your opponent's creature. This doesn't help you as much because if you do want to copy your own creature, you have to give up the original for the turn. Now that's okay if the creature you're copying has a cool ETB effect because it'll enter the battlefield when it unexiles at the end step. Now getting a copy of your opponent's creature is actually better than most clones here because you get to attack with your copy without any fear of trading with the original. But again, if your opponent has a cool ETB trigger, you might want to think first before you clone it because your opponent will get that trigger. This feels like one of the hardest cards for me to rate. I think it is going to be pretty darn solid. So I'm going to start with a B. Could be higher. Could be a little bit lower, but probably not too much lower. I'll first pick it the first time I see it for sure, just to kind of figure out how good it is. But I am going to start with a B. Up next, we have Imprisoned in the Moon. Imprisoned in the Moon is 2 blue for an enchantment aura at rare. Enchant creature, land, or planeswalker. Enchanted permanent is a colorless land with tap. Add colorless to your mana pool. And loses all other card types and abilities. If you haven't played with Song of the Dryads, which is basically this spell except in green, and it turns whatever you enchant into a forest, then you're missing out. This is amazing removal, turning a problematic creature, or maybe a planeswalker, and probably never a land in limited, into a boring colorless land is going to be just incredible. This is premium removal. It should easily be a slam first pick in probably every pack. There's so little that I would ever take over this outside of for monetary reasons at like an F&M. This is just super solid. Absolute flat out A for me. This is just, this is fantastic. Solid A. Up next, we have Ingenious Scab. Ingenious Scab is 2 blue for a creature zombie horror at common. It's a 2/3, it has prowess, and you can pay a blue mana to give Ingenious Scab +1/-1 until end of turn. This is a very 23rd feeling card to me. It's a 2/3 that sometimes can be a 3/2 or maybe a 4/1 with prowess, so maybe you could even do that one more time and make it a 5/1. We all know my prowess warning by now. Blah, blah, blah. In an average limited deck, there's only going to be a very few number of instant sorceries non-creature spells, and so you're not going to trigger prowess all that much. So don't get into Magical Christmas Land with how big you think this guy is going to get in limited. I think this is a very late pack pickup, and I think you probably should cut it if you have a good number of playables already. So this is going to be kind of my stereotypical C-, the cut it more often than you play it kind of card. Up next, we have Laboratory Brut. Laboratory Brut is 3 blue for a creature zombie horror at common. It's a 3/3, and when Laboratory Brut enters the battlefield, put the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard. I don't know about this. I don't think it's great. Without flashback, Self-Mill in blue just isn't quite what it was in the original Innistrad. And in the original Innistrad, I'd probably play this fairly reliably. Obviously, this will help out Delirium a fair bit, and there are some decent graveyard interactions in black and blue that will help you, want to play this as well. But I feel like there's just better ways of going about getting Delirium and those black-blue graveyard synergies anyways. I feel this is pretty 23rd cardy if you want the effect, and if you don't want the effect, I don't think it's really playable at all. I'm going to go with a C- on it. I just don't think it's a card you really want to go out of the way to play. Next up, we have Lunar Forest. Lunar Forest is 2 blue for an enchantment at uncommon. It says, when an opponent casts a spell, sacrifice Lunar Forest and counter that spell. This is horrible, and again, a card that I misread the very first time around. I thought that this was a trigger where you could choose. You cannot. This is just a delayed counterspell that is going to counter the next thing your opponent plays. Counters are not super playable in limited, and they're significantly worse when you play with them revealed to your opponent. I don't think you should play this ever. This should be last pick for sure. Yeah, you are going to counter a spell, But guess what? Your opponent's going to play the least important spell they have in their hand first. And then it's going to get countered by this, and then they're going to play the spell they actually want to play. This is a hard F to me. I had it as D- when I thought that you could actually choose. That's how bad this is. This is just an F. This is a solid F. Up next, we have Mausoleum Wanderer. Mausoleum Wanderer is a single blue mana for a creature spirit at rare. It's a 1/1, it has flying. Whenever another spirit enters the battlefield under your control, Mausoleum Wanderer gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Sacrifice Mausoleum Wanderer. Counter target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays X, where X is Mausoleum Wanderer's power, so it's almost always going to be at least 1, if not more. I wouldn't super recommend playing this. Judge's Familiar wasn't usually very good in RTR Limited, which was basically the same thing without being able to get any bigger, and it was just always pay 1. Obviously, if you're heavy into spirits, then you can maybe make this a 2/2 with some reliability, and it gets a little tiny bit better. But remember what I just said about playing with your counterspells revealed doesn't really ever get you what you want. It might keep your opponent from casting that spell, but don't ever expect that you're going to reliably just get them outside of some sort of rattle chain shenanigans by flashing in a spirit. This seems like a mid to late pickup when you're heavily towards spirits already, and it's not a card that you're going to get super excited about having. So yeah, if you are in spirits, I think it's kind of a C+, just because it's going to be a 2/2 flyer a lot of the times. If you're not in that, then I think it gets a fair bit worse. So kind of C+ if you're in spirits, and more like a C- or even a D+ if you're not. Next up, we have Mind's Dilation. Mind's Dilation is 5 blue for an enchantment at Mythic. Whenever an opponent casts his or her first spell each turn, that player exiles the top card of his or her library. If it's a non-land card, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. Not super playable, but also not an F, I don't think. 7's costly. 7 is very costly. But having this as the top-end card in your blue-black control deck could work out okay. The trick, of course, is that it's not guaranteed to do too much. It'll make it for a story for sure, but there's zero guarantee that you're not going to just hit nothing but lands. And you can't cast lands, so lands are dead draws off this. Hitting a 1-drop probably isn't that good, not at turn 8 or later. It's still a pretty low pick and probably not something you should play very often, but I think it could be fun, and it absolutely could have a good upside. So I'm not going to go with an F. I'm going to go with a D. But I'm not going to go with an F. I do want to try this once just at kind of a fun draft, but in a competitive draft, this is not something I'm looking to pick up. Next up, we have Nevilleghast Herald. Nevilleghast Herald is a 2 and a blue creature spirited uncommon. It's a 2/1. It has flash. It has flying. Whenever Nevilleghast Herald or another spirit enters the battlefield under your control, tap target creature an opponent controls. Seems like a great addition to a spirits deck. It's a 2/1 flyer for 3, which is nicely costed already, and being able to flash it in and stop an opponent's attack at their beginning of a combat step seems pretty good, and you'll have this ready to swing back the next turn. Getting that effect every single turn on future spirits isn't as good unless they have flash as well, but it could come in handy tapping down opposing blocking flyers, for example. It's probably not a first pick in all but the absolute worst of packs, but I think it is still a solid early pickup, kind of early mid-pack, like pick 4, kind of that area. Yeah, I think it's pretty solid. I think it's just going to be great in the blue-white spirits deck. I've got to go with a B- on it. Next up, we have Niblets of Frost. Niblets of Frost is a 2 blue creature spirit at rare. It's a 3/3. It has flying. It has prowess. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. This, I think, is going to also help out the instant and sorcery deck, the spell-heavy deck. Even though it's a spirit, I don't think this goes into the spirit deck quite as readily. It still does. Still does for sure, but I don't think it quite as readily goes into that deck as it does the blue-red spells deck. The effect is pretty darn good. Getting a press for answers tacked on to, kind of every card or every instant sorcery that you're casting for free is pretty darn solid. On top of that, it's a 3/3 flyer that every time you cast one of those instants and sorceries is going to be a 4/4 flyer. So I think this is definitely a solid pick. I think it can be first pickable. I don't think I would take it over premium removal, but other than that, I think I would first pick it. And I'd kind of keep my options open a little. I'd lean towards heading into blue-red spells, but if I ended up in blue-white spirits, it still works pretty well as well. So I'm going to go with a solid B on Niblets of Frost. I like it, and I would first pick it. Next up, we have Scour the Laboratory. Scour the Laboratory is 4 blue for an instant at uncommon. It says Delirium. Scour the Laboratory costs 2 generic mana less to cast if you have Delirium. What does it do? It says cast Ancestral Recall. You draw 3 cards. You draw 3 cards for 6 mana or maybe 4 mana if you have Delirium. So this is, not counting the Delirium part, 1 more mana than Jace's Ingenuity. And it's the same mana as Opportunity, but it draws you 1 less card, so it's definitely worse than both of those pre-Delirium. Probably still playable, but weaker for sure. It is instant speed, which is very nice. Now, if you can enable Delirium, then you're getting yourself a Harmonize, which is actually quite good. This likely goes best with some sort of self-milling scabs, blue-black kind of zombie mid-rangey deck. A deck that definitely wants to hit late game. So that it will have Delirium and it can refill its hand. Getting to refill a significant portion of your hand in the later game is huge for sure. In the deck that wants this, in that sort of deck, this is probably a pretty darn decent card, and I'm going to say it's a B-. Outside of that deck and something more aggressive, you need to make sure that you know that while this is a great card in the one deck, it's a card that you should not be playing in the other deck. Don't play this in your aggressive deck. You're not as likely to get Delirium online, you're not as likely to have 6 mana just floating around, you're not likely to get to that part of the game. So it's kind of a D in those decks, but in the deck that wants it, in the control mid-range deck, and boy, I hope there's a good blue-black control deck in this format, it's going to be more like a B-. Next up, we have Spontaneous Mutation. Spontaneous Mutation is a single blue mana for an enchantment aura at common. It has flash. It says enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets -X -0, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. This might seem a little bit bad, but if you haven't played with Dark Ascension, you might not have heard of the card Chant of the Skiffsang, which was an enchantment that gave -13, -0. And it was really good. It's basically removal. It's one of the better kinds of removal that blue gets its hands on. It's not as good as Claustrophobia, of course, but it's pretty darn close. Now, I don't imagine that it can be too hard to make this -3, -0 in probably most games, and if you are in any sort of self-mill Delirium control type deck, it could go up even higher, potentially up to Chant of the Skiffsang levels or higher. It probably doesn't ever need to be higher, but it can get, pretty decently high. It doesn't look like removal exactly. It looks kind of like a combat trick, but it is not. Trust me, this is a pretty solid card. It's not premium removal, but it is pretty darn solid and should be a relatively high pickup. I've got to go with a B- on it. I think it's going to be pretty solid, and I think for people who have never played with Chant of the Skiffsang, it's going to be pretty surprising how good this is. So, B-, nothing higher because of course it can be a dead card here or there, but B-. Next up, we have Summary Dismissal. Summary Dismissal is 2 blue for an instant at rare. Exile all other spells and counter all abilities. This seems like an anti-storm, anti-combo kind of deck for constructed formats like Modern. I don't really think this has a place in Limited. It's an expensive counterspell. Or not, it's a very expensive counterspell. It's an expensive cancel even that can hit abilities. I just don't see this being something you should ever play. Got to go with a D on it. It's just not for Limited. Just avoid this. Next up, we have Take Inventory. Take Inventory is 1 and a blue for a sorcery at common. It says draw a card, then draw cards equal to the number of cards named Take Inventory in your graveyard. Now be aware, this does not count itself. It resolves while it's still on the stack. So the first one of these is 1 card. The second one, you get 2 cards because it draws a card and it draws 1 because there's 1 in the graveyard, and then it goes up from there. I've never played with this type of effect. I know there's a similar card. The name escapes me at the moment. You guys will remind me a million times over in the comments, I'm sure. But I'm hesitant to expect it to be good. At 1 and a blue, draw 1 card. This is horrible. At 2 blue, draw 2 cards. We have Inspiration, I guess, but it's sorcery speed. And going up from there, it costs more. 3 blue, we're drawing 4, which is Opportunity. And that's a good card, but again, that card was good because it was instant speed. But the time, the card slots that you have to take up with multiple copies of these, dirtling around and around and around, I just don't think that going deep on Take Inventory is worth it. I don't think it's something that I want to do, at least. You're going to need to spend just a ton of cards, a ton of card slots, mana, time, while your opponent just hits you. Yeah, you're going to draw some cards, but you're going to be dead as well. So I'm out on Take Inventory. I'm ready to be proven wrong, but to start, I'm going to be out on it, especially because of that sorcery. I'm going to go with a C-, possibly even lower, but let's start with C-. Next up, we have Taunted Hunter. Taunted Hunter is 1 and a blue for a creature spirit at common. It's a 2/1, it has flying, and Taunted Hunter can block only creatures with flying. Sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Well, it's not. If you've never played with Welkin Turn, you may think this is not that good, but trust me, this is solid. Very solid. Even more solid than Welkin Turn because it's a relevant creature type for this format. This isn't a bomb. It shouldn't be, you know, a massively high pick. You should probably never first pick a Taunted Hunter, but it should be, you know, kind of high mid-pack pick. If you're even slightly thinking about going into blue in any sort of aggressive way. Being a 2-drop, being a flyer means that this is just going to get through for a ton of damage unimpeded against a great number of decks that don't have reach creatures or flyers. It's very solid, perhaps surprisingly so if you haven't played with a Welkin Turn before. Trust me, you won't be disappointed by this. I've got to give it a solid B-. It's just super good. It's way better than you're going to expect it to be. Trust me on that. And the fact that it's a spirit, just gravy. In fact, because it's a spirit, I'm going to bump it up to B. Next up, we have Turn Aside. Turn Aside is a single blue mana for an instant at common. Counter target spell that targets a permanent you control. Typically the best and most playable counters in Limited are the ones that hit creatures, and this explicitly does not hit creatures. It hits instants, sorceries, auras, and that's about it. It's basically negate, but it's not even negate because you can't hit a planeswalker or anything like that. I don't think this is playable. I think maybe you could sideboard it in like most counter spells when you see a really good reason, but there's just not that good of a reason. So I've got to go with a D- on it. I don't think it's any good. Next up, we have Unsubstantiate. Unsubstantiate is 1 and a blue for an instant at uncommon. Return target spell or creature to its owner's hand. It's Remand, right? Well, not quite, because you don't get to draw a card, which means you are going to be down a card when you play this. I could probably see this seeing constructed play, but it's just not Remand without drawing that card. Losing the card draw hurts this way too much. Being able to use this as an unsummon, though, means that it is still pretty darn solid for me. I really like my instant speed bounce cards. I've said that before. I'll say that forever. I think a lot of people might look at this and say, well, it's not Remand, so it's bad. But it's Remand minus a card plus a bounce spell plus unsummon. So I do think this is still definitely playable, and I'm going to pick this relatively highly because of that bounce. Bounce is just so good. I don't think you'll ever first pick this unless the pack is pretty bad. I think you would still take premium removal over this. You would still obviously take a bomb over this. But if you're missing both of those, I think you could first pick this. And I think you should probably always play this in Limited. Be aware, this is not just a counter spell, it is a bounce spell. So I've got to go with a B+ on it personally because of my absolute love of bounce. It might more realistically be a B, but I think it is still a pretty high pick. Finally, the last card in blue is Wharf Infiltrator. Wharf Infiltrator is 1 and a blue for a creature, human horror. It's a rare, it's a 1/1, it has Skulk. Whenever Wharf Infiltrator deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. Whenever you discard a creature card, you may pay 2 generic mana. If you do, put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi horror creature token onto the battlefield. Like many blue cards, I totally misread this the first time. You don't get a 3/2 every time you discard a card. It's when you discard a creature card. And of course, pay the 2 mana for it. Yeah, you don't usually want to loot away creatures. You usually want to loot away lands. So that's a little bit of a problem. However, this card is basically a Looter Ilkor. Looter Ilkor is a really good card in Cube. It's a 1/1 shadow creature that loots when you hit a player. This obviously is a little bit more blockable than a shadow creature, but still, outside of, you know, the people playing 1/3s, this probably will be able to get through and loot, which is pretty darn solid right there. Discarding a creature, that's not as good, but if you're discarding a 2/2 and turning it into a 3/2, well, you know, that's pretty darn solid because you got to loot basically for free. Of course, it can get even better if you're playing madness creatures, but there's going to be less of those, it looks like, than in the Shadows format. Still, I think this is a pretty solid card. I think it is eminently first pickable. I think it's probably a little bit below bomb status, so I'm going to go B+ on it, but I think it is very good and solidly first pickable, so B+ for Wharf Infiltrator. So that's going to wrap it up for blue. Blue looks a little bit better than it did in Shadows over Innistrad. It's definitely lacking in creatures. There's only a few that I think are really, really good and playable, and most of them are rare. But I think it could support a blue-white spirits deck. I think the blue-red spells deck is still there, and I definitely want to continue drafting it with things like Docent of Perfection and some other cards we'll talk about later in the week. But yeah, it looks like a fun color. It's probably not a color I really want to be playing in sealed, so I hope I don't get a whole bunch of good blue stuff at the pre-releases, but I think it looks pretty solid. Definitely let me know what you think of blue and what your favorite colors are, what you disagree with, etc. in the comments down below. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can find me on Twitter at @themanaleek, that's L-E-E-K, like the vegetable, not the card. You can also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/themanaleek and twitch.tv/themanaleek. You've already found me here on YouTube. You've got that comment section down below. Please make use of it. Click that thumbs up icon if you like my content, and click that subscribe button if you haven't, to make sure that you stay up to date on all the latest videos as they get posted. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you all tomorrow for the black set review.